Hello everyone, Paleo Nerd here with my very first ranking video. Today I figured I'd give my personal ranking of all the creature designs featured in Jurassic Fight Club from the least to most accurate. That means I will be starting with the least accurate design and ending with the most accurate, because let's face it, the design that's the most accurate will probably be more surprising than the one that's the least accurate. While the best and worst designs were easy to determine, some of the ones in the middle were more difficult to determine which ones were more or less accurate, so a lot of those are purely subjective on my part. Also, I will be basing the ranking of each design on how different it is from our current understanding of the animal being depicted at the time I'm making this video in February of 2020. This will be based solely on the design itself, so any inaccurate behavior won't be considered. That being said, let's start off with what most people likely already knew would end up being ranked the worst. Fucking Pachyrhinosaurus. Or as one commenter called it, Stupidoceratops succutudinus, which honestly is a much more fitting name for this turd than Pachyrhinosaurus. Based on the fossil site that inspired the episode this animal appears in, this is meant to be a depiction of the species Pachyrhinosaurus locusti, the oldest described species within the genus Pachyrhinosaurus. Yet the only real similarity between the Jurassic Fight Club design and the real animal is the size. Rather than using actual P. locusti fossils as reference, the show frequently uses one particular skeleton from the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Canada. This specimen, TMP 2002-76-1, has been considered to belong to Allosaurus, Pachyrhinosaurus, or possibly a new taxon entirely, with most recent studies putting it closer to Pachyrhinosaurus than to Allosaurus. Unfortunately, the specimen lacks the parietals, which are usually used to diagnose centrosaurines, so it cannot be confidently assigned to any particular taxon. Since the show uses footage of the skeleton so often, it isn't unreasonable to assume they may have based their Pachyrhinosaurus design on the specimen, and since the mural behind the mouth shows a frill resembling that of Allosaurus, that may be the reason why Jurassic Fight Club's Pachyrhinosaurus more closely resembles Allosaurus. If this is indeed the case, then it really comes off as critical research failure, as this specimen was found in the Dinosaur Park Formation, which dates much earlier than the Wapiti Formation where River of Death is set. Even if the Dinosaur Park specimen is Pachyrhinosaurus, it would likely have been a separate species from P. locusti. So now, Jurassic Fight Club's Pachyrhinosaurus is a chimera of Pachyrhinosaurus locusti, Allosaurus horneri, the Dinosaur Park Pachyrostron, and Monoclonius lowii, from which it gets the horn. If you want more reasons why this is the worst design in the whole show, please watch my analysis of River of Death. A very close second to Stupidoceratops, and by far the worst theropod design in the show, is that for Majungasaurus crenatissimus. While Jurassic Fight Club's Majungasaurus has two slightly different designs for the male and female, I'm grouping both designs together as the second worst design in the show. While the skull is a bit too short, the main problem with the design is that the body proportions are essentially the opposite of what they should be. As while the real animal had a long body and short legs, Jurassic Fight Club's version has a short body and long legs, and as a result it is taller than the real animal would have been. The latter proportions are more in line with brachyrostron abelosaurids like Carnotaurus and Albertosaurus, as opposed to the Majungasaurines which Majungasaurus was a part of. There's also the fact that the arms are much more developed than they would have been on the real animal, and the fact that only the male has osteoderms. Also, while I do like this sexual dimorphism, the wattles on the male are probably a bit too much, as Abelisaurids are very basal in the theropod family tree and would have been closer to crocodiles than to birds. In real life, if Majungasaurus was sexually dimorphic, the most you would probably notice would have been one gender being slightly bigger than the other. While this certainly isn't the worst Abelosaurid design, this Majungasaurus design has earned its spot as the second most inaccurate Jurassic Fight Club design, behind Stupidoceratops, and as the most inaccurate theropod design. Next is the Dromaeosaurs, and while which Dromaeosaur design is worse was a bit difficult, I think I figured it out. The third most inaccurate design in Jurassic Fight Club is their Utahraptor. First is the obvious fact that the Utahraptor design has nowhere near enough feathers for a paravian theropod, only having small amounts of feathers on the back of the neck and along the forearm. In reality, all Dromaeosaurs would have been nearly completely covered with feathers, including a tail fan and wings which connect to the second digit of the hand. New skeletal remains described after the show aired have also shown that Utahraptor was much more heavily built than previously thought, while Jurassic Fight Club's model is essentially a larger, recolored version of their Deinonychus model. However, one of the weirdest inaccuracies is the odd Muppet face this thing has, which isn't present on the Deinonychus model. While the stocky Utahraptor is science marching on, Utahraptor never had a dirt face, so it ranks as the third worst Jurassic Fight Club design. Slightly better, but still awful, is the Acheroraptor design. As I've explained before, while the Dromaeosaur in Raptors vs. T-Rex is based on Dromaeosaurus albertensis, the supposed Dromaeosaurus remains in Hell Creek almost certainly belong to Acheroraptor temerdiorum, so I'm comparing this design to how Acheroraptor would have looked. Since Acheroraptor was likely a velociraptorine rather than a dromaeosaurine, the real animal would have been more lightly built with a thinner skull that's curved slightly upwards. I already brought up the feathers, and really the biggest problem with this design is that it is based on a completely different genus. Before someone in the comments brings this up, yes, I am aware that Acheroraptor wasn't described at the time Jurassic Fight Club was made, but even then the only supposed Dromaeosaurus remains in Hell Creek at the time were teeth, which can be incredibly risky when it comes to reconstructing said animal. Calling these remains Dromaeosaurus was a holdover from when paleontologists didn't know as much about the Dromaeosaur family tree, and as such it was common for fossil remains to be assigned to Dromaeosaurus or Sauronitholestes, when in all likelihood most of them belong to distinct taxa. Now that Dromaeosauridae is known to be much more diverse, there is very little evidence that true Dromaeosaurus remains have been found anywhere outside Dinosaur Park or Judith River, with Maastrichtian remains from Hell Creek and Prince Creek likely belonging to different taxa. Now the last of the Dromaeosaur trifecta, Deinonychus. Ironically, the one Dromaeosaur depicted with no feathers at all is probably the one with the most accurate design. While the lack of feathers is very much inaccurate, Jurassic Fight Club's Deinonychus isn't very inaccurate when it comes to its skeletal design, at least compared to Utahraptor and Acheroraptor. Aside from the skull shape and certain limb proportions, the Deinonychus design isn't too bad and is at least identifiable as Deinonychus. Now we move on to the ones that are a bit more tricky to determine which ones are more accurate, so a lot of these could probably go either way. Anyway, next on my list is their depiction of Edmontosaurus annectens. While not quite as bad as the Dromaeosaurs, this design got ranked so low on accuracy based on the fact that there's really not a whole lot to distinguish this model as Edmontosaurus, instead just resembling a generic hadrosaur. It's much too thin and lanky, especially when it comes to the tail. It lacks midline feature scales. It is incorrectly shown as primarily bipedal and occasionally on all fours instead of the other way around. The legs are too long and the front feet are pronated. Then there's the science marching on crap like the hooves on the front feet and the comb on E. regalis that Anectens might have also had. After that is their depiction of Camarasaurus lentis, which only superficially resembles its real-life counterpart. Major inaccuracies regarding the design include an elongated skull and trunk, a shorter neck and limbs, and inaccurate elephant-like front feet, whereas real sauropods had feet shaped more like a cross-section lima bean. While the weight given is accurate, it is oversized in terms of length and height, with measurements given being closer to the larger Camarasaurus grandis, which suggests a possible critical research failure, as lentis is the species that is actually from the site the episode is based on. Next is Brygmophyseter shigensis, which really just looks like a normal sperm whale with larger teeth. While the show's version is massive, about 40 feet or 12 meters long, the real animal is known only from a single partial skeleton and is estimated to reach 7 meters or 23 feet in length, almost half the length of the one in the show. Such measurements fit more with Leviathan, a much larger relative from Peru and maybe Australia. However, Leviathan wasn't described until after the show aired. Not only is the show's design too big, but it's also too thin, as the real animal was more robust and its body shape was more like that of the modern pygmy sperm whale. Therefore, Brygmophyseter is probably the worst non-dinosaur animal design in Jurassic Fight Club, which is why it's ranked so low. Now we're back to the dinosaurs with Jurassic Fight Club's Ceratosaurus, likely based on Ceratosaurus nasicornis. Despite this, the actual design looks a lot more like the Allosaurus model, just recolored with a new head, one extra finger, and scoots added. Like most theropods not called Tyrannosaurus rex, their Ceratosaurus is also unnaturally thin, and the proportions of its limbs are off, as both the arms and legs should be shorter. There's also the elongated trunk and tail. As I said before, it's not a good thing if fucking Jurassic Park has a better Ceratosaurus than you do. Possibly tied with Ceratosaurus is the animal Jurassic Fight Club was obsessed with showing killing the shit out of Ceratosaurus, Allosaurus. Specifically, Allosaurus fragilis, the only species known from either fossil site that its episodes were based on. Aside from the typical pronated hands and shrink wrapping, the show's Allosaurus has a thinner and lower skull along with shorter legs and hands lacking a large claw on the first finger. It is also slightly oversized, with the measurements given in both Bloodiest Battle and Hunter Becomes Hunted being closer to that of the much larger Morrison Allosaur Saurophaganax. Jurassic Fight Club's Tyrannosaurus rex is okay for the most part, but the main reason it's ranked here is because of the incorrect skull shape. I seriously do not understand why it's so fucking difficult to just trace over the skull. Like, it's not that hard. The pronated hands, teeth out of the sockets, weird looking legs and feet, and the fact that the juveniles look identical to the adults isn't exactly helping either. After that is Albertosaurus sarcophagus, which ironically resembles Nanotyrannus more than it does an actual adult Albertosaurus. The design is much too gracile for such a large animal, and it should be more heavily built overall. The back is also too arched, and the tail should be longer. Pretty much the only good thing about this design is that it isn't as bad as the Stupidoceratops it shares its episode with. Next is Gastonia burgei, whose design in Jurassic Fight Club originally had me praising it as the best herbivore design in the show. Unfortunately, further comparison shows that this is no longer the case. The head and overall body should be flatter, the neck should be longer and covered in separate armor plating, and it likely had a separate armor plate above the hips. Tenontosaurus tolleti is a pretty good design for the most part, only having two major inaccuracies. Those, of course, being the more iguanodon-like head in contrast to that of the real animal, as well as more hadrosaur-like front limbs in contrast to the more basal iguanodontian forelimbs. The model for Stegosaurus stenops is probably the most accurate when it comes to herbivorous dinosaurs, as really the only inaccuracies design-wise is that the neck and tail were longer on the real animal. However, this wasn't known at the time this model was made, so this was much more accurate for the time, but as I said before, I'm comparing them to our current understanding of these animals. One other problem is that the animal is oversized, being closer in size to the larger species Stegosaurus ungulatus. From the most accurate herbivorous dinosaur to the most accurate theropod in the show, Nanotyrannus lancensis. Regardless of whether or not Nanotyrannus is a juvenile T-Rex, the design itself is still pretty good. From the skull shape to the proportions, it's almost a complete match to the known Nanotyrannus specimens at the time. There are some minor problems like pronated hands, lack of possible filaments, and a shorter neck, but overall this is still probably the most accurate theropod design in the entire series. Besides being placed in the wrong genus and not having the right proportions, Jurassic Fight Club's depiction of Arctodus Megalodon is at the very least better than their dinosaur designs. It's around the right size, and most of the really inaccurate stuff is just the result of George and the narrator knowing jack shit about sharks. Then again, how much can you really screw up a shark? Next is really a tie between Arctodus simus and Panthera atrox, as they're really good for the most part except for the heads. While Arctodus's head is too small, Panthera's head is too big, so their episode ends up being a fight between a pinhead bear and a bobblehead lion. They're also both grossly oversized, so there's that. If you thought Arctodus and Panthera atrox were the most accurate designs, then you're in for a surprise, because there's actually one last animal in this show with a design so accurate it blows all the other ones out of the water. That is, of course, the Azhdarchid pterosaurs from Raptor's Last Stand. Although they're small for Azhdarchids, you could make the argument that they're juveniles, and while Azhdarchids technically aren't known from the time this episode is set in, I'm only judging these animals on their designs. And they are glorious. Sure, it's pretty much just a smaller Quetzalcoatlus, but that works in this show's favor because they actually managed to depict Azhdarchids with accurate body proportions, something that Walking with Dinosaurs and When Dinosaurs Roamed America both failed at. Also, they have pycnofibers. Sure, they're poorly rendered and don't look that good, but the important part is that they're there. Honestly, probably the worst part about this design is how much better it is compared to the other animals in this show. I mean, what happened to not having the budget for feathered dinosaurs? If you could put pycnofibers on pterosaurs that appear for like 5 seconds, you can put feathers on dinosaurs. It's not fucking rocket science. It also comes off as ironic, since most other dino documentaries don't bother with pycnofibers, but give their dinosaurs feathers. But here, it's the reverse! God, I hate this show. That concludes my ranking of all the Jurassic Fight Club designs. Just remember, most of this was purely subjective on my part, so it's perfectly fine if you don't agree with this ranking and would have done this differently. Just be sure to tell me your personal rankings down in the comments, and up next will be my take on improving Jurassic Fight Club, followed by the scientific analysis of Monsters Resurrected's first episode, Terror Bird. I hope you enjoyed this video. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content like this, and this is Paleo Nerd signing out.